morning and Assalamu alaikum. I want to welcome everyone to the House of Commons for the launch of the Census report about British Muslims in numbers. And I'm delighted to see so many people have attended, and also members of Parliament as well. The Census of England and Wales, carried out by the Office for National Statistics, is every 10 years, and it's an important national resource providing central and local government with essential information and data for a resource of allocation and service delivery. But it's also invaluable to civil society and the voluntary sector for its advocacy work. And it's excellent that a Muslim community organisation, the Muslim Council of Britain, has analysed the census data to build a profile of the British Muslim population. I've only had time to skim through this report, but it raises important issues for all of us with a vision of Britain as a more equitable society. Inequalities of wealth, income and education are becoming more marked. One of the statistics from this report is the high percentage of Muslims living in the most deprived local authority districts. Policies which can address local regeneration, employment and health initiatives in these areas will be good for all people, regardless of their ethnicity or faith. Another statistic that caught my attention is the extent of ill health amongst older Muslim women. In the last few months, I've raised issues around health on numerous occasions in Parliament, and I also take close interest in the work of the Royal Bolton Hospital, which is in my constituency. So if there's going to be less money spent on health, then the situation is going to get worse, not just for the Muslim elderly, but for all the elderly, who are, of course, an increasing proportion of the population. There are other matters that this report shows, and it gives much food for thought. And so I'm really pleased to be able to host the launch of this report today.
On behalf of the Muslim Council of Britain, Assalamu alaikum and welcome. We are grateful to have a couple of parliamentarians here, and hopefully once their business of the day is over, they'll be joining us. And welcome to all our guests. A lot of the time, the national conversation about Muslims tends to focus on extremism and counterterrorism. And the census output is an opportunity for Muslim civil society to present its own agenda in terms of what are our concerns and our priorities. So first of all, let me call on Dr. Shuja. Dr. Shuja has a long-standing record in the Muslim Council of Britain. He was Deputy Secretary General. He has served, done public service on many of his committees, particularly the Health and Medical, Chaplaincy, Animal Welfare, and he's directed the Spiritual Health Project. As you can gather, he's a medical practitioner from this account, and he has served as head of a public health laboratory and an NHS consultant.
Today is an important event for the British Muslims because it's the culmination of efforts and a campaign that started almost 25 years ago. Since the early 1990s, Muslim advocacy groups have worked closely with the other faith communities to ensure that British social statistics take account of the religion dimension. For Muslims, this has been a matter of strategic importance. We lacked precise data on our population or socio-economic situation. The ethnic categories was useful, but still meant that the picture was incomplete. Thus, in 1999, a part of the interfaith lobbying of parliamentarians, the Muslim Council of Britain issued the following statement. Publicly funded services and projects in areas such as health, housing, education, training and other community services can be better targeted if religion is taken into account. If it is not, large sections of the Muslim population will continue to be marginalized and disadvantaged in British society. Many Muslims do not make use of community services because these are not sensitive to their religious factor. The inclusion of a religion affiliation question will also send a signal to the British Muslim community that their presence and contribution is recognized. So that was the statement issued at that time. As a result of this broad-based lobbying, our parliamentarians passed an amendment to the Census Act which allowed the religion question to be included as a voluntary question in the 2001 census. However, further interfaith lobbying was required to ensure that the question was retained in the 2011 census. Not only has the Muslim community benefited from this data, but the other faith communities too. For example, the Church of England has collated census data on households on the 13,000 parishes in England and Wales. Similarly, I would commend the Institute of Jewish Policy Research for its fine reports drawing on census demographic data. The work of Dr. Sundar Ali and her team in the MCB's Research and Documentation Committee has involved much data analysis and consultation. They have been keen to present the data warts and all about British Muslims. They have looked for positive developments since the last census, but have not shied away from raising some of the uncomfortable realities which challenge Muslim civil society to get its house in order. Dr. Sundar will no doubt be referring to these in her presentations. Well, in conclusion, I would also like to record our appreciation of the work of the Office for National Statistics, who have made the census data for England and Wales so easily accessible and have enabled civil society groups to base their advocacy work on hard facts and evidence. I endorse the Chair's welcome to you all and would like to thank you, the distinguished guests, peers, members of Parliament, professors and media, as well as well-wishers who are committed to a fair and objective understanding of the situation of the Muslim population of Britain and the aspirations of Muslim Council of Britain for a just and cohesive Britain. Thank you.
This report is the fulfillment of several decades of effort by Muslim civil society, which started with the work by the Youth Action Committee on Islamic Affairs in the 1990s, and then the Muslim Council of Britain through its affiliation and the membership of the various other faith communities. The MCB Secretary General, Dr. Suja, has mentioned the importance of the interfaith coalition that work together, and I welcome to record my appreciation, in particular the magnificent work that was carried out by Reverend Leslie Francis and the former director of Interfaith Network, Brian Pierce. I remember the struggle we had in convincing our parliamentarians and senior civil servants for the need of a religion question in the census. There was a time in 1998 when the prospects for a religion question in the census seemed to be slipping beyond our grasp. We then directly raised the issue with the then Home Secretary, Jack Straw, and spoke to individual parliamentarians from all different parties. I remember the key role played by Lord Wetherell, the former Speaker of the House of Commons. In the 11th hour, I had no option but to phone the Prime Minister Tony Blair's office and press Rizana Hakim, the advisor and the private secretary, to remind the PM of his promise to us about including the religion question. If I may say at this moment that over a period of time, meeting different parliamentarians, when that initial question was raised, there was a bit of a concern in terms of where is the need for this question of religion. Bearing in mind, as we heard earlier, the census over the years have always had the question, or well, over the last 2-3 decades, question on ethnicity. However, it was identified that there was clear lacuna in the legislation because the role of the faith communities, which I think was important and has been identified over the years, was not duly recognized. This was a question of religion of such strategic importance because in the 1990s we did simply not know how many Muslims there were in Britain, and estimates varied from very wild guesses of 1 million to 4 million. We only had vague ideas of our ethnic diversity and the geographical distribution or the scale of unemployment and educational underachievement. We did not know how and where to press our case for fairness in employment practices and provision of services. Equally importantly, we now have a better understanding of ourselves in terms of our ethnic diversity and the percentage of the population in different age bands. If our mosques and institutions are to be representative, this diversity needs to be reflected in the mosque committees and other decision-making forums. We now have data from two censuses, the 2001 and 2011, and facts about the Muslim population that does not exist in any other European country. And we will, of course, be getting the full details from the presentation from Dr. Sundas. It is important to note that the census data demolishes two myths. The first is that Muslims are taking over, and second, that Muslims are self-segregating. With 1 in 20 of the population, how can Muslims be possibly taking over? The MCB report also cites the expert analysis that Muslims are now more geographically spread than 10 years ago. It is a fact that Muslim population has increased from 1.6 million in 2001 to 2.7 million in 2011. Why has this occurred? A question being asked time and again. Well, there are several factors which are highlighted in this report, which include the age profile of British Muslims who are younger and so in the family rearing stage of life. Moreover, there have been new settlements in the last 10 years from many parts of the world, particularly the travel sports, notably Somalia, Iraq and Afghanistan. Having a report like this from the MCB is a dream come true for many of us. I and colleagues in the MCB and its Research and Documentation Committee, who have been pivotal and instrumental in getting the information across, are determined that this does not become yet another report that gathers dust on the shelf and is a starting point for the active engagement with policy. May I finally say, to express our gratitude and the appreciation for the wonderful work being carried out by the REDOC committee, in particular our chair, who is the current chair, Dr. Karim Wakil, who unfortunately is not with us, but the founder chair of the REDOC committee, Dr. Jamil Sharif, who has steered through this initial period. And I know sometimes we are perhaps the public face to those difficult measures that have to be taken up. But the real work that has taken place has been people like Jamil and his team. So great appreciation for that wonderful work and the continued work. Now that we've got Dr. Sundas with us and her report that has been prepared is something that's really a testament of the commitment from the members of this voluntary committee. I hope and pray that the information that's available to us is a beginning for us to work on many other difficult problems that we are facing. And it is the culmination of the efforts of the faith communities put together that has enabled this final position where the question on religion is finally in the census. Many thanks.
I thought before I go into the key findings, let's just think about the three big questions usually which come to our mind when we look at a report. How is the report original? Who is the audience? And what are its key findings? So the findings of this report, as I mentioned in the beginning, are the most comprehensive and reliable for Muslims in Britain, as they are derived from the best possible sample size, i.e. the most representative sample. The 2011 census covered 94% of the usually resident population of England and Wales. The ONS professionalism is to be greatly respected. And as I mentioned earlier, this is the first detailed report that has been prepared from within Muslim civil society. Who is the audience for this report? The report has several audiences in mind. Media commentators requiring a ready reference guide to British Muslim statistics, community organisers in the Muslim voluntary and social enterprise sector reflecting on present-day social realities and future priorities, decision makers in social policy and public service delivery with whom the MCB can initiate a discussion and debate on Muslim concerns and aspirations, and researchers considering new lines of inquiry. The style and content of the report reflects this intended diverse readership. So what are the key findings of this report? Now, it's been quite difficult for me to extract the key findings for this presentation. As I was going through the report, I thought, which ones are the ones that I should focus on? And I say it's been difficult because there are so many findings, because we did cover a range of variables for Muslims. But in my own subjective assessment, I've come up with 10 key findings, which I will reflect on today. So the 10 key findings of this report, which you can reflect on today and take back with you. So in terms of the Muslim population, we found that Muslims form under 5% of the population in Britain. So perhaps contrary to popular belief, Muslims are taking over. The data actually shows that Muslims are still a minority. And this is a point that Sir Iqbal also mentioned in his talk. So perhaps some of the headlines we see in the media of Muslims taking over are scaremongering. So the point really to take away is that they are still a minority, because this is what the data shows us. There is a Muslim population, small or large, in all local authority districts in England and Wales. And also, we found in terms of population that actually evidence shows that since the last census, which was 2001, geographical dispersion has increased. And we cite the work of Ludi Simpson in the report, who says that ethnic minority populations of England and Wales have grown and live in more mixed areas in 2011 than before. This spreading out has accelerated in the past 10 years. This finding perhaps counters the perception of self-segregation or self-segregating communities. However, there is concentration in some inner city wards. And we found that almost half of the British Muslim population are British-born. That's 47%. The overwhelming majority of them identify themselves as British, i.e. they choose their foremost national identity to be British. Now, here our findings are consistent with other studies and other data sets, like the Citizenship Survey and the Labour Force Survey. We also found a high level of English language competence amongst Pakistanis and Bangladeshis. So the key message to take away from here is that Muslims are overwhelmingly, they choose their national identity to be British. We found that not just ethnically, but also socio-economically they are diverse. As Dr. Abdul Bari would term, a community of communities. So within the British Muslim population, we have different communities that are emerging and that exist. So the key message to take away from this finding is that British Muslims are diverse internally. There is perhaps a community of communities. Now let's look at the age profile of the British Muslim population. This is a very interesting finding. We saw that the Muslim population is overwhelmingly young. So we found that 33% of Muslims were aged 15 years or under in 2011, and this compares to 19% in the overall population. And only 4% of the Muslim population was aged 65 years or above, compared to 16% in the overall population. The key message to take away from this finding is that Muslims are overwhelmingly young. In terms of education, we found that there is an increased level of education amongst Muslims since 2001. So how did we measure this? We found that in 2001, 39% of Muslims had no qualifications. In 2011, this percentage had decreased to 26%. So this is an improvement. And we found that almost half of the Muslim full-time students are female. Now let's look at how Muslims are doing in the labour market. So there, we found that the number of Muslims in the higher managerial and professional occupations has increased. And we also found that there's a high proportion of small employers and self-employed Muslims. This is an indication of their entrepreneurial interests and aptitudes. We also looked at the family structure of the British Muslim population in the census, and we found that there is a high percentage of Muslim married households with dependent children. That's 35% compared to 15% in the overall population. And this is consistent with the younger age profile that we found earlier. So the key message from that is that Muslims are mostly married with children, but also we do see an emergence of newer kinds of family structures, of single-parent households and people living on their own. In terms of housing, that is a notable percentage, and however, if we look at some of the other findings, we see that 43% of Muslims own their property and 30% privately rent. So really the key message here is that Muslims are still facing economic challenges, but they also have a prospering community. Now, deprivation, I would say this is one of the surprising findings, or it was one of the most difficult ones to actually derive at as well, because we derived this through the index of multiple deprivation, and we combined that with the local authority district level data from the census. We found that almost half, that's 46% of Muslims in Britain, reside in the most deprived areas. And what do I mean by that? I mean the 10% most deprived local authority districts. The key message here is that there is a significant population of Muslims living in deprived areas. But this is not also, it's important to point out that this is not exclusively a Muslim concern. Now, last but not least, health. We looked at the variable which is self-perceived health, so it's not actual health, but studies show that there is correlation between actual and self-declared health. We found that there are health concerns amongst Muslims, particularly amongst the elderly Muslims, aged 50 plus. So the key message to take away from this finding is that elderly Muslims face poor health outcomes, in particular elderly Muslim women. So having gone through my 10 key findings quite quickly though, and I hope you have been able to digest them, and I hope I wasn't too fast, but now let's just think about the implications for Muslim civil society. The findings of the report pose some positive findings, some negative, or shall we say some challenges, but these challenges require action by Muslim civil society. These challenges are in the areas of the prison population of Muslims. This also, the report has details on this. The social isolation issues, so our finding about the single parents with dependent children or Muslims living alone, this was a surprising finding. Perhaps there are divorce issues there are social isolation issues that need to be thought about, and maybe the ideals and the aspirations of the British Muslim community are changing. There is a newer generation that needs to be engaged with. And of course, provision for the elderly. So at the moment, yes, the British Muslim population is overwhelmingly young, but they will get older, and that's something that that Muslim civil society needs to think about. How will it provide for the elderly? Because of course, as we know, there are different cultural differences between religions, and Muslims haven't really thought about that. And thank you very much for listening. Yes, I hope you enjoyed my presentation. Thank you.
I'd like to congratulate her on a very rigorous, authoritative and dispassionate study, and it tells the story as it is, without pulling any punches, but without pushing any particular agenda or cause. Tells the good news as well as the bad news. So I think it is a model of dispassionate social science research. I'd also like to underline some words in the foreword which Dr. Shuja Shafi wrote, where he emphasized that social statistics, such as those in the census, are the lifeblood for advocacy and representation work, and they're also, they should be, the lifeblood for policymakers and for journalists and the media, and of course they always have been for academics like myself. And they're crucial for a number of reasons. Obviously, perhaps most importantly for us here, for identifying where the problems are. What are the challenges that we need to be tackling? And Sundas has told us about a number of those, and I'll come back to them briefly. But they're also, I think, very important for dispelling myths. And I think one of the problems that the Muslim community faces in Britain and elsewhere in Europe are a number of myths and stereotypes and false assumptions about the nature of the Muslim community. So I think it's particularly important, and I think a major role for social science is to tackle these myths and to point out that they are oversimplifications when they're not simply error. What Sundas's work has also done is to identify the areas where we essentially need more detailed studies and research. Academics always say, oh, we need more research. I'm afraid it's always true, but essentially the census and the other large-scale government surveys which I've used in my own work are descriptive. So they enable us to nail the myths and the stereotypes and to challenge them. They enable us to see where the problems lie, but they don't give us the answers as to what we should do next. There's always an important step from sort of seeing where the problem is to understanding why that problem occurs. And unless you understand the why, you can't really formulate the right policies. Descriptive work cannot on its own tell us what the right policy recommendations should be. So I think it's crucial that we use the report to focus on the challenges and then to understand what is driving these challenges, what are the sources, what therefore should we be doing to tackle them. And there are obvious issues, to what extent is, which I think Omar might be talking about a bit more, to what extent are some of the problems that have been identified, for example, the overrepresentation of young Muslim men in prison, the high rates of unemployment among Muslim women, and to what extent is that due to racial discrimination, to what extent is it due to Islamophobia, might it be due to policy, preferences and voluntary choices on the part of the different communities. We need to understand the mechanisms, the drivers of these problems. And I should say I'm very delighted that another of my former students has secured funding for a major new cross-national study of discrimination, doing rigorous field studies, which will give us another handle on one of the crucial drivers, we think, of some of these challenges and problems. I was also very struck by the way the report has emphasised both diversity and change. Again, this is one of the myths that I think one needs to be challenging all the time, that treating Muslims as a single, homogeneous, static community. The Muslim community is highly diverse internally. It's also changing continually. It's changing across generations. It's changing just because British society is changing. It's changing in parallel with the changes. Nothing is standing still. And it's very important, again, to understand that. And particularly important in issues to do with geographical segregation and so on, where there are quite dramatic changes going on. And finally, I want to pick out one other point which is made in the report, and which we have also found in some of our own sort of independent research, and that was the statement that Muslims are looking for fairness, not favours. And that's something that we actually explicitly asked questions about in our ethnic minority election survey. We found among the Muslim respondents, as among other ethnic minority respondents, no desire for favours. The ethnic and religious minorities are looking for fairness. And that brings me to the issue of British values. Fairness is a British value. We hear a lot of talk from politicians about the need for various minority groups to teach British values. I think there's also an important moral obligation on the white British elites to practice their own British values of fairness and tolerance, and in a way to overcome many of the challenges that we face throughout Europe with disaffected and alienated youth. And the most important, I think, way of dealing with it is for British society and French society to live up to their own ideals of fairness and social justice and tolerance, that a welcoming environment is the best recipe for overcoming these problems. Thank you.
You may know that Runnymede was founded in 1968, and our founding sort of statement is that we were founded to nail the lie about racism in British society. And we believe that this task remains important, and that the particular form of racism called Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism deserves particular focus and attention. And as some of you, or many of you, may well know, we also in 1997 produced a report called Islamophobia that remains one of our most widely read and important reports. And despite, I suppose, some challenges in the use of the term Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism, I think the distinctions offered in that report between, for example, open and closed views of Islam, and most of the analysis in that report are still true today. And I think you see that in the analysis of this report. That report, of course, did not have these data. So I think this is, picking up on the points that have been made. The report that we produced could not have done what we've done today. So I'll make 5 or 6 quick points about the report. First is that it's very welcome and excellent summary. As Anthony says, it's good to see hard evidence, good social science that is relatively dispassionate. I won't go over these in detail, but you can just see the wealth of information. Second and related is that the report shows the continued importance of data collection. And I think that's an issue that we need to highlight, not just for British Muslims, but more widely. And I think some of the data transparency agenda that we see from policymakers is too narrowly focused on the question of how does public money get spent, and not enough on how do policies, how do outcomes affect different groups in society, whether those are religious minorities or whether those are in particular local areas. So I think this is a great argument for better data collection. This is an issue that my predecessors at Runnymede first campaigned on in the 1970s to get an ethnicity question in the census. Without data, we cannot measure, understand, much less respond to social issues, including, of course, ethnic and other inequalities. So whatever other policy questions that the British Muslims raise in Britain today, policymakers must do more to support British Muslims in the labour market, including in better translating their increasing educational attainment into economic success. And I wanted to say something about that, not least as Anthony has picked it up, and I do think it is a key finding, the sort of increased educational attainment amongst British Muslims. It's very good to see that, but it's also very good to see the report highlighting the wider issues of racism, especially in the labour market, where people with African and Asian-sounding surnames, which include, of course, many Muslims, but also many non-Muslims, have to send in twice as many CVs. And Anthony supported a lot of this work just to get an interview. So if you have an Asian or African-sounding surname, you have to send in twice as many CVs. Many of you probably are familiar with that. We also commissioned a report on Muslim and Black Caribbean and African female unemployment, and we had evidence from participants in that research that women change their surnames when they're applying for jobs. They take off headscarves when they go to interviews. Clearly, that sort of behavior is resulting in the employment labor market outcomes that British Muslims would like, not reflecting their increased educational attainment. Third, and I want to emphasize this is a sort of Runnymede point, is that we, just sort of to clarify, Islamophobia is a form of racism. And we think it's really important to state that. I know it's not been part of your report, but I feel that's one of the reasons I've been invited here, and that we must continue to fight its manifestation, whether it's abuse on streets and buses, racist comments in the media, or being refused a job by an employer. And this report is one of the tools that we can use to fight that. At Runnymede, we would also argue that Islamophobia is indeed related to other forms of racism, empirically and conceptually. As Anthony's already hinted, the kinds of racism that employers practice is often just based on looking at CVs, so not looking at people. And it's sometimes hard to disentangle how far is that anti-Muslim versus straight, old-fashioned, anti-racist discrimination. And so our response to it, whether it's in terms of how we mobilize politically, socially, against it, or in terms of policy design, we think at Runnymede must build on a wider anti-discrimination or anti-racist platform. A related fourth point is that, as the report makes clear, British Muslims generally do not have any difficulty, and as has been widely argued, affirming British values, nor do they experience much difficulty in identifying with Britain. The findings from the census are not only unequivocal, but they further resonate with previous studies, as Sundas said, the Citizenship Survey, the Labour Force Survey, the Ethnic Minority British Election Study, Ipsos Mori British. There's many surveys continue to show this finding, and I would suggest that we should probably stop asking it in surveys because we're not gaining any further knowledge. If we're going to ask questions about British Muslim identity, perhaps we shouldn't ask whether or not they feel British. I think we know the answer. I'm going to put things just a bit more sharply because Anthony has also already hinted at it. But just as there are disagreements concerning whether social class or ethnicity better explains ethnic inequalities in Britain today, so people disagree. Is it because black people are more likely to be working class that they experience inequalities, or is it because of racism that they suffer inequalities? And I think we can have some honest disagreement, though some dishonest disagreement about that. So too are there disagreements about whether religion or race better explains the worst outcomes for British Muslims today. And it was really positive, I think, to see in the report a recommendation that further work particularly should be done on British Somalis, who I think that the anecdotal and some suggestive evidence shows have very serious problems in the labor market and deserve further study. I think Anthony has also been a bit modest here in that he hasn't highlighted his own research that there is actually a specific Muslim penalty in the labor market over and above any ethnic penalty in the labor market, which indicates the necessity to do further research, but also the value of it. I'll now move on to my final point, which is, Muslims are a diverse group, and it's good to see that highlighted. And I think in thinking about our analysis of their social experience and the ways in which they mobilize socially and politically, their own ethnic, national, and class background clearly affects their outcomes in Britain. Just as Runnymede recognizes that there are various forms of racism and various ways that groups mobilize against that discrimination, so too should we recognize that the diverse experiences of Muslims in Britain, while still acknowledging that they are all vulnerable to anti-Muslim prejudice or Islamophobia. We know from the census data and more widely that Muslims are like many other Britons in insisting that we can and should jointly oppose all these forms of racism and affirm our commitment to those British values such as equality and tolerance. I think this is both a principled and a tactical point, as no minority group can ever force a majority to recognize their demands in a democracy. But even as we must uphold a more universal or common anti-racist principles and practices, if we wish to respond effectively with real policy solutions to real social problems, we will always need to understand the specific realities and experiences of particular groups, and understanding that this important report on British Muslims has advanced significantly today. Thank you.
May I say that it's an excellent report, as everybody else has said. There are some good things in the report which I'm pleased to note, and we need to build on our successes. That's fine. My more concern is about the challenges that the report illustrates. Challenges in terms of low attendance in schools and colleges, high unemployment, prison population increase 14%, and then health issues, diabetes, heart, TB, mental health, which has been mentioned. I'm going to be very brief, and what I'm going to say is that what we don't really only want to do is produce a report and then leave it to the government to implement it in the way. We need to follow it through. And what we have seen, even the government has or political parties have recognized that there is low attendance in various schools. And pupil premium, millions of pounds went into it. And the recent report showed it can work. We need to know why exactly it did work. Did we put the money in the right place? Did we put the right mechanism in place? And how was it monitored? Why did we leave it for X amount of time to find out it's not working? And one of the other areas we need to perhaps do more research in some of these challenges that we have noticed, we need to go further into the background of this and to see what, and I'm sure you will find some particular areas, communities within communities where you will find more problems. For example, you might find within the Muslim community, you find the Bangladeshis children are doing better in schools than maybe Pakistani children. And when you look at the Pakistani children, or Pakistani origin I should say, they're all British, more or less, you might find that those who originate from the rural areas of Pakistan are maybe doing not as good as those in numbers who come from the urban areas in Pakistan. So what I'm saying to you is we need to look into those areas more into detail to find out where the problem lies. Otherwise, you might find yourselves in a losing situation where the money might be allocated and be allocated and maybe spent in the areas which didn't actually, for which the money didn't actually come for.
Thank you, Dr. Gunn.
I think it's right that the MCB should be commended for the fact that they took the step of actually having this analysis done. And I think censuses are carried out every 10 years for a reason. And one of the reasons is to allow local authorities, governments, planners to work out the needs and where they might be coming from, whether it's school places, whether it's hospitals, whether the aging population, what kind of provision needs to be in place. And it's great that there has been, from those census, a more detailed, comprehensive analysis done of the Muslim community and how it's fitting in, its challenges it's facing. And the report clearly is throwing up quite a few challenges. As I say, it's good news, but there's also some not such a good news. And that's really where I suppose the policymakers, the politicians, the local authorities and everything have to come in to do their part. And I think it is important that this report does go out to ministers, whichever government happens to be, should go out to the politicians as well, so they are aware of the fact that when they are doing this policy planning, that they are looking at it properly, and that, as Lord Gurban has said, that the resources are actually being targeted in an appropriate way and in the right way as well. But of course, it still leaves many challenges, and I think those perhaps, money can only go so far. There are sometimes we have to change things in the way we do things as well, and how we look at society, and internal things that perhaps within the Muslim community that we can bring changes which will perhaps help, along with what government policies are working together to resolve the issue. And therefore, I just want to obviously thank all the contributors, everybody who attended, all the speakers, and the MCB for organising this event. And I'm hoping that we've all learned and more wiser, but hopefully we can all go back to wherever we live or whatever work we do and try to see how we can build upon this analysis and how we can make things better, for not just for the Muslim community, but actually for everybody, other communities that we live with and coexist with. Thank you.
Thank you.